They called her unsinkable, a marvel of modern engineering, the pride of the White Star Line. Yet beneath the polished brass and glistening decks of the RMS Titanic, a secret was burning, quite literally. Few people know this, but before the Titanic even left port in Southampton, she was already in serious trouble. Deep within her hull, tucked in a section known as Coal Bunker Number 6, a fire had broken out. A slow, smoldering blaze that had begun days, possibly even weeks, before the ship set sail on her ill-fated maiden voyage. This wasn't just a flicker of flame. According to records and reports that surfaced decades later, the fire reached temperatures of nearly 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to warp steel and compromise the structural integrity of even the sturdiest hull. Yet somehow, some way, this was kept quiet. Whispers were exchanged between crew members. Senior officers knew, engineers were aware, but the fire was never disclosed to passengers or the public. The official reason? They didn't want to cause panic. But that explanation raises even more disturbing questions. Coal bunker fires weren't completely unheard of during that time. Coal, especially when piled improperly or too densely, could spontaneously combust. But on a ship of this size, such a fire presented a serious threat, not just to safety, but to the ship's ability to sail and survive. The men tasked with feeding the Titanic's hungry engines were forced to shovel burning coal into the furnaces just to keep the fire contained. That meant working in extreme heat, in dangerous conditions, with no end in sight. And while they fought the fire, the ship's fate was already being sealed. The heat from the fire focused around the starboard side of the hull, directly near the point of impact with the iceberg days later. Experts believe the heat weakened the steel plating significantly. What might have been a survivable glancing blow instead became a catastrophic rupture. The steel was brittle, compromised, and ready to fail. But why was this detail hidden for so long? Why did no one speak out? Some suggest loyalty to the White Star Line, others hint at a coordinated effort to preserve reputations and avoid lawsuits. Either way, the evidence remained buried, just like the Titanic herself, for nearly a century. It wasn't until rare photos surfaced showing scorch marks on the starboard hull that people began to ask, what else aren't we being told? The Titanic didn't just hit an iceberg, she hit it at her most vulnerable point, where fire had quietly eaten away her strength. And yet, this is only the beginning. Because if this fire was known and still ignored, what else was hidden beneath the surface? What if the fire wasn't just a tragic accident? What if it was a warning sign ignored, or worse, intentionally silenced? As the Titanic steamed across the Atlantic, few on board knew that their journey was already shrouded in secrets. We revealed the coal bunker fire deep within the ship's hull. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. Because when you follow the trail of evidence, you stumble upon something far more chilling than fire. A pattern of silence, last-minute decisions, and powerful figures who mysteriously vanished from the ship's manifest just before it sailed. Let's start with one name: J.P. Morgan. The American banking tycoon, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the world at the time, was also the owner of the White Star Line, which operated the Titanic. He had a luxurious suite reserved on the ship. Luggage and fine furnishings were already loaded on board. But just one day before departure, Morgan abruptly canceled his trip, claiming he felt ill and needed to remain in France. Strange, isn't it? He wasn't the only one. Several other elite industrialists, bankers, and political figures also changed their minds at the last moment. Meanwhile, some of their rivals, businessmen who opposed central banking reforms or had competing financial interests, remained on board and perished in the sinking. Coincidence? Or calculated absence? Critics of this theory say it's a stretch, a classic case of connecting dots that aren't there. But when you dig deeper, the timeline becomes harder to ignore. The fire in Coal Bunker Number 6 was reported before Titanic left the dock. Engineers had inspected it. Internal memos acknowledged the issue. Yet rather than delay the voyage or inform passengers, Titanic was rushed to sail, perhaps to maintain schedules or protect the White Star Line's reputation. Or maybe, something even more deliberate. There are whispers, dark theories whispered for years, that the Titanic was sacrificed. Not just a result of negligence, but a calculated decision made by people in power who stood to gain more from the ship's destruction than its success. Some suggest Titanic's sinking cleared the way for massive financial restructuring. After the disaster, public support for centralized banking increased in the U.S., eventually leading to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. That's just one theory, but it's one that has gained traction in conspiracy circles. Whether it's a business decision gone wrong, a criminal cover-up, or a tragic series of ignored warnings, one thing is clear: too many people knew too much and said too little. The fire may have started the chain reaction, but the real disaster was in the silence, a silence that cost over 1,500 lives. So ask yourself, if a fire was hidden and powerful men vanished just in time, what else were they trying to hide? We've all heard the simple version. The Titanic hit an iceberg, tore open its hull, and sank. But that version leaves out something critical: the condition of the ship before the iceberg ever appeared. By the time the Titanic struck the iceberg on April 14, 1912, it wasn't just a luxury liner, it was a ticking time bomb. Previously, we explored the coal fire that had been burning deep within the ship and the suspicious silence surrounding it. Now, let's look at the moment of impact and how what should have been a survivable collision turned catastrophic. At 11:40 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spotted the iceberg ahead. The crew tried to maneuver the ship, but it was too late. The Titanic scraped along the starboard side, directly over the area where the coal fire had been raging just days before. That seemingly small detail changes everything. Why? Because the area of impact had already been structurally weakened. Metallurgists and naval engineers who examined pieces of the Titanic's hull decades later made a startling discovery. The steel used in the ship wasn't just ordinary, it was brittle and sensitive to cold temperatures, especially after being exposed to prolonged high heat. The fire had essentially cooked the steel, reducing its strength by up to 75%. In other words, the iceberg didn't tear through a healthy ship, it tore through one that was already damaged. Survivors described the collision as relatively mild. No one was thrown off their feet. In fact, many didn't even realize anything had happened. But below deck, steel plates buckled and rivets popped like gunshots. Water surged into 5 compartments, more than the ship was ever designed to withstand. Here's where it gets even more chilling. Other ships had previously hit icebergs and survived. The Titanic was built with watertight compartments, an innovation meant to prevent this exact kind of tragedy. But what the designers didn't account for was human error, or internal sabotage. Some experts now argue that the true cause of the rapid flooding wasn't just the size of the iceberg, but the location of impact, the exact area that had been compromised by the bunker fire. In essence, the iceberg delivered the final blow, but it wasn't strong enough to sink the Titanic on its own. The ship had already been softened from within, weakened where it mattered most. The iceberg, then, wasn't a villain, it was the trigger. The real disaster had been set in motion before the Titanic ever touched the sea. So if the ship had been made of uncompromised steel, if the fire had been extinguished before departure, if the voyage had been delayed for proper repairs, would Titanic still be sailing in our memories, without 1,500 lives lost beneath the waves?
The Titanic didn't just collide with an iceberg. She collided with destiny, one shaped by fire, silence, and decisions made far from the public eye. But what if her end wasn't just a result of bad luck? What if the Titanic was doomed from the very beginning? From the moment her hull was laid in Belfast, the Titanic was surrounded by ambition. The goal? To build the largest, fastest, and most luxurious ship the world had ever seen. But speed and spectacle came at a cost. Corners were cut, warnings ignored, and risks taken in silence. Previously, we explored the coal bunker fire, the strange disappearances of powerful men, and the vulnerability of the ship's hull. But now, let's connect the final dots and ask the uncomfortable question: was the Titanic set up to fail? One of the biggest red flags lies in the very materials used to construct the Titanic. Studies of recovered hull fragments revealed that the rivets, the iron pins holding the steel plates together, were poor quality wrought iron, riddled with slag impurities. Metallurgists concluded that under cold temperatures and high stress, these rivets would become brittle and prone to snapping. That's exactly what happened on the night of April 14, 1912. When the ship scraped the iceberg, the compromised rivets failed, allowing the hull to tear apart and water to rush in. Now add the coal fire, which had already weakened the steel, and layer in the fact that lifeboats were insufficient by design, carrying only half the number of passengers on board. It paints a picture not of one mistake, but of a cascade of avoidable disasters. Then there's the silence, the refusal to delay the voyage, the lack of public disclosure about the fire, and the secrecy surrounding missing elites who chose not to sail. In hindsight, it almost feels orchestrated. The Titanic was marketed as a marvel, but the truth behind her construction and operation reveals a darker reality. A ship rushed to completion, launched at any cost, and promoted as perfect, even when it was deeply flawed. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a system failure, one rooted in human arrogance, corporate greed, and an obsession with power. Today, over a century later, Titanic's story is still told in classrooms, documentaries, and Hollywood films. But the full truth remains murky beneath the waves. Her legacy is not just one of heroism or heartbreak, but a cautionary tale about what happens when warning signs are ignored and when truth is buried deeper than the ocean floor. So the next time you hear that the Titanic sank because of an iceberg, remember this: the iceberg wasn't the beginning. It was the final chapter in a story of silent flames, broken steel, and secrets that were never meant to surface.